August 23rd, 2009. Gladwin, Pennsylvania. 29-year-old Toni Lee Sharpless attends a party with her friend, Crystal Johns. When Toni becomes intoxicated and starts making a scene, both she and Crystal are asked to leave. While driving away, the two friends get into an argument, which leads to Crystal being kicked out of the car, but Toni does not return home and is never seen again. Over the next few years, there would be some intriguing leads, including a license plate reading from Toni's car in New Jersey and an anonymous letter claiming that she was killed during an altercation with a police officer, but no trace of Toni or her vehicle is ever found. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and we've got an odd missing persons case to cover today. The 2009 disappearance of Toni Lee Sharpless. This is a story which was featured on the true crime show Disappeared, and it is both a tragic and baffling mystery. Toni was a single mother who struggled with bipolar disorder and seemed to be getting her life together, but decided to cut loose one night and go out partying, even though she was not supposed to be drinking alcohol because of her medication. By the end of the evening, Toni was highly intoxicated and displaying erratic behavior, and after ordering her friend out of her vehicle, Toni drove off and vanished without a trace. In missing persons cases where an individual and their vehicle disappeared together, the most logical explanation is usually that they drove into a body of water, which would make sense given the inebriated state Toni was in at the time. However, multiple searches of the nearest river have failed to find Toni or her car, and there are a pair of strange leads to suggest that Toni made it to New Jersey at some point, and that there might be more to this story, including an alleged police cover-up. Since we'll be reaching the 10-year anniversary of Toni's disappearance next month, I thought this would be an ideal time to do an episode about this case, because it sounds like the investigation has reached a standstill. Anyway, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the unsolved disappearance of Toni Lee Sharpless. Our story begins in Pennsylvania in 2009. Our central figure is 29-year-old Toni Lee Sharpless, who lives in West Brandywine Township. Toni is the single mother of a 12-year-old daughter, but even though she became pregnant at age 17, Toni decided to keep her child and still managed to graduate with honors from high school. She later became a certified nursing assistant in order to pay her way through the Brandywine School of Nursing and moved in with her mother and stepfather, Donna and Peter Knabel, so they could help her raise her daughter. She eventually graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Nursing, and this led to her getting a job as a registered nurse at Lancaster General Hospital, where she specialized in infectious diseases. But unfortunately, throughout the course of her life, Toni suffered through a series of breakdowns which involved manic and depressive episodes, and she underwent numerous hospitalizations. It was not until 2004 when she was officially diagnosed with bipolar disorder and went on medication to treat it. In April of 2009, Toni went through a manic episode and checked herself into rehab for 3 weeks. She also used this opportunity to undergo alcohol treatment, as she had been arrested for driving under the influence the previous year. When Toni left rehab, she had a prescription for some new medication, which she would take daily to control her bipolar disorder. For the next 4 months, Toni's life seemed to be in a good place, as she alternated between working long shifts at her nursing job, spending time with her daughter, and making plans to work on her master's degree. On Saturday, August the 22nd, after completing an overnight shift at her hospital, Toni spent part of the day with her longtime friend, Crystal Johns, whom she hadn't seen since her stay at rehab. Crystal invited Toni to go clubbing with her that evening, and since Toni hadn't spent a night out partying in a while, she asked her mother and stepfather if they would look after her daughter. Her plan was to stay overnight with Crystal before returning home the following day. Donna and Peter were uneasy about the idea, since Toni was not supposed to consume alcohol because of the medication she was taking, but they reluctantly agreed to her request to watch her daughter, and last saw Toni when she left their house at 9:30 p.m. Toni and Crystal both eventually wound up at a Philadelphia nightclub called the G Lounge and crossed paths with Willie Green, a player with the National Basketball Association's Philadelphia 76ers team. Since Crystal was friends with Green's brother, both she and Toni were asked to join him in the VIP lounge, and after the nightclub closed at 2 a.m. on August the 23rd, he invited the two women to join him for a party at his house, which was located on Bow Barn Drive in the affluent suburb of Gladwin. Toni and Crystal traveled to the party, but while she was there, Toni's behavior began to change. Throughout the course of the night, Toni consumed a lot of alcohol, and she had also not gone to sleep after completing her overnight shift the previous morning, so by this point, she had been awake for 36 consecutive hours. According to Crystal, she was hanging out in the swimming pool shortly before 5 a.m. when she was approached by Willie Green, who said, "Your friend is freaking out, and you both need to leave." Toni had started to behave erratically as she became angry with another guest and poured an entire bottle of champagne on the floor. When she was asked to leave the party, Toni grew belligerent and started yelling and kicking things before she began crying. Crystal grew concerned because she had not seen behavior like this from Toni since before she checked herself into rehab months earlier. After they left the house, Toni got behind the wheel of her 2002 Pontiac Grand Prix GT before she drove away with Crystal. However, Crystal expressed her concern that Toni was too intoxicated to drive, which caused them to break out into a heated argument. They only made it about 500 feet before Toni stopped the car and demanded that Crystal get out. Crystal exited the vehicle before Toni drove away, but this would turn out to be the last time she was seen alive. Crystal figured that Toni would come to her senses and return for her, but she never did. She attempted to call Toni, but could not reach her because her cell phone was turned off. As a result, Crystal was forced to phone her nephew to come pick her up. Toni never returned home that morning, and after not hearing from her for the entire day, her family subsequently reported her missing to the West Brandywine Police Department nearly 18 hours after she was last seen. The police failed to turn up any trace of Toni, and they could not locate her Pontiac Grand Prix as well. Toni's family even went so far as to perform their own search of the Gladwin area to see if they could find any evidence that she may have been involved in an accident, but they found nothing. What made the situation even stranger is that Crystal claimed there was less than a quarter tank of gas left in the Grand Prix at the time they left the party. Since West Brandywine Township was about 35 miles from Gladwin, it seemed unlikely that Toni could have made it home without stopping for fuel, but there was no record of her having done so, and there would be no more activity on Toni's bank account or credit cards. The last time Toni's cell phone was used was at 2:57 a.m. on August 23rd, 2 hours before she went missing. Toni's daughter had texted her mother to let her know she was having trouble sleeping, so Toni texted her back to say she'd be home soon. The phone itself would be turned off around the time Toni went missing, and was last picked up by a cell phone tower at 4:53 a.m. Crystal, Willie Green, and everyone else who attended the party were interviewed by police, but cooperated fully, and none of them were considered suspects. Since there were a lot of rumors circulating that Crystal was not being truthful, and knew more about Toni's disappearance than she let on, she personally volunteered to take a polygraph test and wound up passing. The morning before she went missing, Toni phoned her mother from work to ask her to check if she was running low on her medication and call the pharmacy if her pill bottles needed a refill. For this reason, her family did not believe she willingly stopped taking her medication before she disappeared, but they suspected that the unstable combination of the medication and alcohol caused her to have a manic episode. Since the Schuylkill River was located in close proximity to Gladwin, there was fear that Toni might have driven into the water and drowned. There was one particular spot where she could have taken a wrong turn and wound up at Flat Rock Park, and since it was dark and Toni was heavily intoxicated, it would have been easy for her to accidentally mistake a boat ramp for a road and driven her vehicle into the river. An extensive search of the river was performed by Texas EquiSearch, but while they found quite a few submerged vehicles in the water, none of them were Toni's Pontiac Grand Prix, but there would soon be an interesting development. On September 8th, over 2 weeks after Toni went missing, a neighborhood in Camden, New Jersey was being patrolled by a license plate reader, a machine mounted on top of an unmanned police vehicle, which automatically read the license plates of all the parked vehicles it passed. It wound up getting a hit on the license number DND 7772, which matched Toni's missing Grand Prix. This location was only about a 20-minute drive southwest from where Toni was last seen, but unfortunately, it would be 6 days before the West Brandywine Police Department received an alert about the license number match. They traveled to Camden to perform a search for Toni's car, but it could not be found. The location where it was supposedly parked was known for being a high crime area. Toni had traveled to Camden on one previous occasion to attend a concert, but apparently said that she could not wait to get out of there and never wanted to return. Toni's family soon turned to a private investigator named Eileen Law, who offered her services pro bono. For the sake of official record-keeping, Law still charged them $1 to hire her, and claims that she still keeps the $1 bill they paid on her desk as a constant reminder of Toni's case, and that she will return it to the family when Toni is found. Anyway, according to Law, there would be numerous reported sightings of Toni in Camden in the months following her disappearance, as well as additional sightings in Philadelphia and Lancaster, where she worked as a nurse. Since Toni's license plate number was flagged in a neighborhood known for having high amounts of prostitution and drug activity, Law has always pushed forward the idea that Toni may have become a victim of sex trafficking after she arrived in Camden. Toni did have past issues with drug addiction, though Crystal maintained that she did not witness Toni use drugs on the night she went missing. Law has also claimed that once she started investigating Toni's case, she received anonymous threatening phone calls warning her to quote-unquote back off, and she also once found dead animals in her mailbox. But in spite of all the reported sightings of Toni, no one has ever uncovered any concrete evidence that she was still alive for any period of time after she drove away from the party in Gladwin. Toni had been planning to take her daughter on an outing to a state park the day after she went missing, so in spite of what personal problems she may have been experiencing at that time, Toni's family did not believe she would have willingly abandoned her child. Her case would garner national coverage when it was featured on an episode of Disappeared in February of 2011, but the investigation would remain at a standstill until a surprising development took place nearly 2 years later. In late November of 2012, Eileen Law received an envelope at her office postmarked from Trenton, New Jersey, and was surprised to see that the sender was listed as Toni Sharpless, though Toni was misspelled with a Y instead of an I. When Law opened the envelope, she found an anonymous handwritten letter on a piece of yellow legal pad paper. The writer claimed that he lived in Philadelphia, and that in the last days of September of 2009, a friend of his from Camden offered him $5,000 to dispose of a car. The vehicle in question was a black, four-door Pontiac Grand Prix, and he wound up driving it from Brooklawn, New Jersey, to an auto body shop outside of Boston, where it would be destroyed. The writer initially assumed that it was a stolen car, but when he spoke to his friend the following day, he was told it actually belonged to a missing woman. The writer's friend told him that he was friends with a Camden police officer who had killed the female driver during a fight, which is why they had to get rid of the vehicle. The writer was allowed to keep the license plates, which had the number DND 7772, and his friend also gave him Toni's social security card in case he knew of any women in their late 20s who wanted to quote-unquote paper trip, which is jargon for assuming a new identity. The writer claimed he put the plates and the social security card in a box inside his garage and forgot about them for the next 3 years, until his daughter recently found them while playing. He attempted to contact the Philadelphia police to share this information, but was told they did not have jurisdiction, which is why a detective gave him Eileen Law's address. He said he was currently visiting New Jersey to help some people out after Hurricane Sandy, and decided to use the opportunity to send Law a letter from there. The most interesting detail in the letter is that the writer wrote down and provided the last 5 digits of the vehicle identification number for Toni's Grand Prix, which turned out to be correct, and he also provided Toni's cell phone number as well. Law sent a copy of the letter to the authorities, who have ultimately concluded that it was probably a prank, but even if the letter was not entirely truthful, Law still believes the writer might be trying to tell them something. Since Toni's disappearance, her mother and stepfather, Donna and Peter, have taken custody of her daughter and raised her. But unfortunately, after nearly a decade, there are still no answers about what actually happened to Toni. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. So this is a really tough story, not only because it's a very sad and baffling mystery, but also because it's easy for discussions about this case to degenerate into victim blaming. I once heard Toni's mother, Donna Knable, do an interview in which she discussed the frustration over some of the remarks she's seen in comment sections whenever this case receives coverage online. It's unavoidable to talk about this case without acknowledging the fact that Toni did make some unwise choices on the night she went missing. The medication she was taking to control her bipolar disorder seemed to be working quite well at that time, but the instructions specifically stated not to consume alcohol. But not only did Toni go out partying and get pretty intoxicated, but she also decided to do so after not having slept for around 36 hours. And of course, even when things started spinning out of control, she still got behind the wheel of her car when she was clearly in no condition to drive, before kicking Crystal out of the vehicle and stranding her without a ride. That's a pretty lousy thing to do to a friend, though if Toni's disappearance was in fact an accident brought on by drunk driving, then the situation may have been a blessing in disguise for Crystal. Overall, however, I do think that victim blaming in cold cases can be very counterproductive, and it's a terrible thing for the victim's family to experience, so this is the last time I'm going to dwell on Toni's personal decisions that night. While Toni certainly wasn't perfect, I can still feel a lot of empathy for her. I've never experienced bipolar disorder, so I'm not going to pretend to know what it's like to live with something like that. I know that Toni went through a number of struggles, but it sounds like she was legitimately trying her best to make a good life for herself and her daughter. Toni was only 17 when she became pregnant, and while there's no information out there about who the father was, I think it's pretty obvious that he had no part in his child's life. So Toni had to undergo the challenge of being a single mother and putting herself through nursing school, but in spite of her personal demons, she seemed to be succeeding very well and was thought of as a great mother. It's pretty heartbreaking to know that Toni and her daughter texted each other in the middle of the night because she was having trouble sleeping, and this turned out to be the last time they ever communicated. Now, to be quite honest, when I first watched the Disappeared episode about this case back in 2011, I was leaning towards this being a tragic accident where Toni drove her car into a body of water. Whenever a person goes missing alongside their vehicle, I generally lean towards that being the solution. Yes, a search was performed of the Schuylkill River, but it was mostly centralized around an area which they figure was the most likely spot for Toni to have accidentally driven into the water. But the entire river is 135 miles long, and given the state of mind she was in that night, Toni theoretically could have gotten lost and wound up in the water anywhere, and is yet to be found by any search teams. Over the past several years, there have been a number of missing persons who have been found submerged in a body of water inside their vehicle decades after they originally vanished. This particular story is reminiscent of another unsolved missing persons case from the Philadelphia area, which was also covered on Disappeared, where a couple named Richard Petrone and Danielle Imbo vanished without a trace while driving home from a night out in their pickup truck in 2005. To this day, opinions are still sharply divided about whether they were victims of foul play or if they simply drove into the Delaware River and have yet to be found. While my initial impression was that Toni was the victim of an accidental drowning, the appearance of the anonymous letter stating that Toni was killed after an altercation with a police officer has changed my perspective a bit and has opened up the possibility that something a lot more sinister took place. I mean, I certainly think there's some credibility issues with the scenario outlined in that letter, but I don't think it's entirely implausible either, and I can't overlook the fact that the writer provided details which they should not have known if they were not personally involved in this case. But let's start from the beginning and discount the one theory which I'm absolutely certain did not happen. I think there's no chance that Toni was killed at the party at Willie Green's house. If you go back and look at the original media coverage of this case, there were some people, including Toni's family, who doubted Crystal Johns' version of events, and people started spreading speculation online that something might have happened to Toni at that party, which prompted everyone to orchestrate a cover-up and dispose of her body and her car. I'm sure a lot of this gossip stemmed from the fact that Willie Green was a fairly famous figure in Philadelphia at that time, as he played for the 76ers basketball team for 7 years, and I'm sure a lot of people were tempted to paint this as a story of a pro athlete who used his fame and influence to cover up some criminal behavior. Well, the truth is that it was nothing more than an unfortunate coincidence that a woman went missing after leaving Willie Green's house, and the police always stated that Green was nothing but cooperative with the investigation, making it clear that neither him nor anyone else who attended his party were considered suspects. And besides, if something did happen to Toni while she was there, I seriously doubt that all those people could have kept quiet about it for this long. It's also important to point out that Crystal Johns was never considered a suspect either, though she was certainly the subject of a lot of wild rumors and speculation herself. Toni's family seemed to feel a lot of resentment towards her, and it's clear that Crystal was no saint herself, as she had once pled guilty to 2 counts of harassment years earlier. Crystal got a lot of heat over the fact that she allowed Toni to consume so much alcohol, but she has always maintained that she was unaware that Toni was not supposed to be drinking because of the medication she was on. And I can believe she's being truthful, because this was the first time Crystal had seen Toni since her previous stint in rehab. Even though police had told her she was not a suspect, Crystal personally volunteered to take a polygraph, something which I'm sure most attorneys would advise you not to do. But even though polygraphs are unreliable, I think Crystal just wanted it on the record that she passed. What's indisputable is that Toni had some sort of meltdown before she went missing and was not acting like herself. For this reason, you really cannot apply logic to her actions or discount any possible scenario because she could have conceivably driven anywhere. So now we'll explore the other theories, which don't involve Toni driving into the river. According to Crystal, Toni had less than a quarter tank of gas left in her car when they drove away from the party, and it sounds like this wouldn't have been enough fuel for her to make it all the way back home to West Brandywine Township. It's very easy to imagine a scenario where Toni ran out of gas and was harmed by someone who pulled over to help her, but if that's the case, what happened to her car? Well, the one piece of evidence which has made people believe that Toni did not simply drive into the Schuylkill River was the fact that her license number was picked up by an automated license plate reader in Camden, New Jersey, 2 weeks after she went missing. I think it's important to look at the geography of this situation. Toni lived about 35 miles west of Gladwin, and Camden is located around 15 to 16 miles southeast in the opposite direction. So even if she didn't have enough gas to make it back to West Brandywine Township, she probably would have had enough to make it to Camden. An eastbound exit for Interstate 76 is located in close proximity to where Toni was last seen, so she easily could have turned in that direction and wound up in Camden by mistake. Perhaps the reason her license number was picked up in that particular neighborhood was because this is where Toni ran out of gas. So there were apparently a lot of reported sightings of Toni in Camden around the time period her license plate was flagged, leading to speculation that she might have become involved in drugs or sex trafficking. I know that Toni's family said that she had a good life going on and never would have willingly abandoned her daughter, but that's the thing about bipolar disorder. It's completely unpredictable. Toni was in an irrational state of mind at the time she was last seen, so if she somehow got lost and wound up in Camden while she was off her medication, who knows what could have happened. It seems like the major proponent of this sex trafficking theory was Eileen Law, the private investigator hired by Toni's family. I think that largely stems from the fact that in the year prior to Toni's disappearance, a pimp named Alan E. Brown, aka Prince, was arrested for running a sex trafficking ring in New Jersey. Brown had been doing this for 20 years up until that point, using violence and drugs to control a number of young women and force them into sex work. Of course, Brown was already behind bars by the time Toni went missing, but perhaps she crossed paths with someone else who did the same thing to her. But overall, even though there have been a number of sightings of Toni in Camden, Philadelphia, and Lancaster, here we are 10 years later, and no one has ever uncovered any conclusive proof that Toni was still alive after the morning of August 23, 2009. As we've seen in countless missing persons cases, eyewitnesses can be mistaken, so these sightings may have been from people who saw another woman who resembled Toni. All that being said, the flagging of Toni's license number in Camden on September the 8th has been seen by some people as conclusive proof that she was still alive for some period of time after she went missing. However, there's a potential alternate explanation for this. In one article I saw published about this case, it specifically mentioned that while the camera from the license plate reader was able to read the license number, it was unable to pick up the actual state listed on the plate. And that's a very important detail because in the United States, 2 different states can issue different license plates with the exact same number. This actually leads us into a rather funny story which, appropriately enough, involves another pro athlete who played in Philadelphia, former National Hockey League star Jeremy Roenick. At one point during his career, Roenick left the Phoenix Coyotes in order to sign as a free agent with the Philadelphia Flyers, and after moving to Pennsylvania, he had a tendency to run through toll lanes without using an easy pass to pay the toll, causing him to rack up thousands of dollars in fines. Well, it wasn't long before some elderly gentleman living in the state was shocked to receive a bill for all of Roenick's fines. It turns out that when Roenick moved to the area from Phoenix, he was still driving a car with his original Arizona license plates, which got tagged when he ran through all those toll lanes. The problem is that this poor elderly man had the exact same license number as Roenick, only with Pennsylvania plates, so when Roenick's number got tagged, the automated system sent the bill with all the toll fines to this other guy. So theoretically, the vehicle which was flagged by the license plate reader in Camden could have had Toni's license number, but plates from a different state besides Pennsylvania. Of course, I'm not saying that's what happened. Given Camden's close proximity to the location where Toni went missing, it would be quite a coincidence if her license number showed up there on an entirely different vehicle. But this does demonstrate that the license plate reading is not infallible proof that Toni's Pontiac Grand Prix was there. Here's what I think the main issue is. The 2 biggest pieces of evidence supporting the idea that Toni traveled to Camden are the license plate reading and the anonymous letter claiming that she was killed by a police officer. But the problem is that both these pieces of evidence seem to contradict each other. As you recall, the writer of the letter claimed that he was paid $5,000 to dispose of Toni's Pontiac Grand Prix by driving it to a body shop near Boston, but if Toni was the victim of a police cover-up and they needed to destroy the evidence, why would her vehicle have been parked outside in a public neighborhood to be picked up by the license plate reader? Well, there's one possible explanation which might account for this. I find it interesting that the writer of the letter claimed he was approached about disposing of the car in the last days of September in 2009, 1 month after Toni went missing. So let's just say that Toni was pulled over by a Camden police officer, which led to some sort of altercation where she was killed. The perpetrator may have thought that their best course of action would be to abandon her car in a high-crime section of Camden in hopes that it would eventually be vandalized or stolen and cease to be their problem. But then the license number is picked up by a license plate reader on September the 8th and flagged as being connected to a missing woman. If someone from the Camden Police Department was involved in Toni's disappearance, they may have found out this information was going to be passed along to the West Brandywine Police Department, so they realize they have to move the Grand Prix out of the neighborhood and get rid of it. The letter writer specifically said that they were asked to move the vehicle from Brooklawn, which is only about 5 miles south of Camden, so perhaps it was temporarily hidden there while they figured out what to do. According to the writer, he was asked to drive the vehicle to Boston by a friend of his, but he did not actually learn that it belonged to a missing woman until after he returned. This is when he learned that his friend happened to be the friend of a police officer who killed Toni, so if the writer is telling the truth, it seems like he never interacted with the officer personally and only heard this story third hand. It's hard to know what to make of the letter. On one hand, in most cases where there are allegations of a police cover-up, you can usually find some suspicious behavior on their part to make you suspect they're hindering the investigation. But until that letter showed up, I see no indication that the Camden PD did anything suspicious. I know that the West Brandywine PD looked into the writer's allegations, but it doesn't sound like they found anything to raise any red flags with the Camden PD. It seems like investigators now lean towards the letter being a hoax, though Eileen Law has stated that even if the scenario described in the letter is not entirely true, the writer might still know something. Quite frankly, the idea of Toni getting into an altercation with a police officer and winding up dead is not all that far-fetched, given her erratic behavior at the time she was last seen. She was driving while heavily intoxicated, so if Toni was pulled over and went through a manic episode in which she tried to be confrontational with the police, you can definitely see how things might have escalated out of control. If she was stopped by the Camden police, then this would have meant that Toni had taken a wrong turn somewhere when driving away from Gladwin, which probably would have put her in an even worse frame of mind. It's also worth mentioning that the letter never specifically says that Toni was pulled over, only that she was killed in a fight with a police officer. So for all we know, maybe she did travel to Camden and was alive for a while after she went missing, but was killed at a later time in an entirely different situation. The most convincing detail about the letter is the fact that the writer provided the last 5 digits of the Grand Prix vehicle identification number, which he claims he wrote down while getting rid of the car. While the description of the Grand Prix and its license number were mentioned constantly during the media coverage of the case, I don't believe the VIN was ever mentioned. It's also interesting how the writer provided Toni's cell phone number as well, though it's not entirely clear how he would have obtained that information to begin with, since he never made mention of handling her phone. Remember, phone records showed that Toni's cell was turned off shortly before she went missing, and it still hasn't been found to this day. The part of the letter which stretches credibility for me is the writer's claim that he kept the license plates and Toni's social security card inside a box for 3 years and completely forgot about them until his daughter found them. This apparently bothered him enough to send an anonymous letter, but why did he not feel this way 3 years earlier when he first learned about what happened? Also, you'd think that if he wanted to provide definitive proof that this story was true, he might have included Toni's social security card when he sent the letter. Part of me wonders if the letter is some sort of half-truth, and that Eileen Law is correct in her assumption that the writer is trying to tell them something. He might have legitimately been involved in Toni's disappearance, or have some knowledge of what happened, which is how he was able to provide specific details like the last 5 digits of her vehicle identification number. However, his story about Toni being killed by a police officer could be a complete fabrication, and the real truth is a whole lot different. The writer may have wanted to clear their conscience, but also downplay their own complicity, so they minimize their involvement by claiming that the perpetrator was the friend of a friend, and all they did personally was dispose of the evidence without finding out until after the fact that it was connected to a missing persons case. If Toni was pulled over by the police at some point, then you'd assume the officer would have called in or recorded her license number before he approached her. Unless the Camden PD somehow managed to completely bury the incident, there should have been some record of this traffic stop somewhere to be uncovered by investigators. And I think that if the Camden PD was that thorough about destroying evidence, Toni's car never would have been left out in the open to be picked up by a license plate reader to begin with. There are times when I'm inclined to go with Occam's razor and believe that Toni and her vehicle are still in the Schuylkill River somewhere, but something tells me that her car did wind up in Camden at some point. It's possible that Toni was in such a bad place mentally that she drove there and parked in that neighborhood, but something happened to her after she left her vehicle. Perhaps some of the alleged sightings of Toni in Camden were legitimate, but she soon became a victim of foul play and was no longer alive by the time the investigation put their focus there. There is just so little evidence to work with that the only way this case might be solved is if the letter writer was legitimate and he decides to come forward and share everything he knows. If he's being truthful, he might not actually know what happened to Toni's body, but at the very least, he might be able to disclose the identities of the people who would know. One of the things about missing persons cases which just hits me is when the victim had a child at the time they went missing, and you realize that so much time has passed that this child is now an adult. Toni's daughter would be in her early 20s, but she has had to spend the past 10 years growing up without her mother. Hopefully, she can receive some answers about what happened someday, so if you happen to have any information about the unsolved disappearance of Toni Sharpless, please contact the West Brandywine Police Department at 610-380-8201. That's 610-380-8201. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email under the subject line Trail Went Cold Contest to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past year, we've already produced a bunch of exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and I recently recorded a bonus episode titled The CrimeCon Chronicles, in which I share my personal experiences attending CrimeCon these past 3 years. And for our patrons in tier 3, I've also recorded a new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. So to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I'd also like to take a moment to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up to support us on Patreon this week, and they are Keelan H., Michael L., Billy H., and Nina M. Thank you all so much for your support. And before I bring this episode to a close, I'd like to play a promo for another new podcast, Dark, Dark World.
Hi there. I'm the host of a new true crime podcast called Dark, Dark World. With Dark, Dark World, we explore lesser-known killers and crimes, stories that have slipped between the cracks of the mainstream true crime consciousness. My name is Jordan Crittenden. Join me as I explore this dark, dark world by subscribing to the show wherever you get your podcasts.
And since I just mentioned CrimeCon, I wanted to provide one more reminder that I will be appearing at another event, the True Crime Podcast Festival, being held at the Marriott Downtown Hotel in Chicago on July the 13th. I will be teaming up with Christy from Canadian True Crime to do a live show at the event, in which we will each talk about a Canadian case, and I'm going to be discussing a baffling murder which took place in our country and is yet to be solved. We are only 1 week away, so if you would still like to purchase tickets to the event and haven't already done so, feel free to visit their website at tcpf2019.com. And of course, later this summer, on August the 18th, Christy and I will also be participating in another true crime podcasting event at the Royal Cinema in Toronto, which will also include Jordan from the Nighttime Podcast, Nina from Already Gone, and Aaron from Generation Y. At the event, we will be doing a presentation about the Donnellys, an infamous Canadian true crime case from the 19th century, and the show will also include panel discussions, an interactive Q&A, and a meet and greet. Tickets are $25 each, and you can find the link to our website to purchase them in our episode description. I also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. Need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, or Spotify. Anyway, as a tie into my appearance at the True Crime Podcast Festival, I will be covering a case from Chicago on next week's episode, so I hope you will all have a good week, and join me next Wednesday for another brand new edition of The Trail Went Cold.